So let me ask you a question, are you getting sick and tired of top 10 lists on YouTube? Well, if the answer's yes, it's probably because they're all getting a little bit samey. There are only so many games that you can fit into a top 10 greatest games of all time list. But Scott over at SEGABlocks, he's asked us something a little bit more personal. He wants to know what our top 10 most memorable games are. Well, if you want to see mine, you just wait until after these. Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel. If you're new to the channel, well, firstly thanks for clicking on the video, and secondly brace yourself because you're just about to get a guided tour through my history of gaming thanks to Scott over at SEGABlocks asking me what my top 10 most memorable games are. Well, I suppose we better get on with it, and because my history goes back quite a way,
you just hope,
I've decided to do this as always in chronological order. And the first most important game in memory for, well, I would imagine everyone, is their very first experience of video games. And for me, well, that just happened to be this, a Binatone TV Master Mark IV. Now, if you don't know what it is, well, you're probably quite young. It's a Pong clone, that's quite simply what it is, and this was the first ever, not this particular one here, this is one I picked up later, but Pong and Pong clones were the first games that I ever played, and I can remember with, well, such clarity back in late 1977, maybe early 1978, when my dad walked through the door carrying one of these bad boys here. Now obviously it's not cutting edge gameplay at the moment, but you know what, I'm glad because we have to move on. But back then, back in the 70s, this was the masterpiece of all gaming. And to have something like this in your home where not only could you play it yourself against the computer, or what made for a computer in this old orange and black 70s retro piece of, well, let's call it art, but you could also play against another player, another human player, most likely your best friend or your brother, or maybe even one of your parents if you could talk them into it back in the day. So yeah, the very first memory I have of video games was back in the late 70s with one of these Pong clones playing that classic game, and you know what, it's something everyone should try from time to time, or at least for the first time if you've never played it. And it's not like there's only one option to play Pong these days, there's many options. You don't need one of these, you certainly don't need an RF cable, so get out there and make some memories of your own with Pong. Coming in at number 9, we're moving forward in time yet again of course, and it's 1982. Now, it was an odd time in video game history in 1982 because we were just knocking on the door of the great video game crash of, well, 1983 over in North America. Now, fortunately, we didn't have the same problem over here in Scotland or the rest of the United Kingdom, or Europe even for that matter, because we had 8-bit microcomputers coming onto the scene. And, well, this game that's coming in at number 9 is Hungry Horace and a ZX Spectrum, and it was the very first game that I owned, and that's probably why it's one of the most memorable games for me, because I don't know, look back in your own history, what was the first game that you owned? Now, not only that, my parents, they weren't exactly gamers because obviously back in 1982 video game technology was still fairly new and fairly uncommon, especially amongst adults. But my mother, for some reason, loved Hungry Horace and can play this little Pac-Man clone until the cows came home. So yes, coming in at number 9 in 1982, Hungry Horace for the ZX Spectrum. Now coming in at number 8, we're only going 1 year forward into the future, so we're going to 1983, and the game again is, yes, it's on the ZX Spectrum, and it's a game important to me in terms of memorable games because it was the first game that I ever got, well, let's say fully immersed in, and that game is none other than Orbiter from Silversoft. Now, as I said, this was the first game that ever got me fully immersed. And by that I mean quite simply, if I started playing this game back in 1983 when I was 10 years old, I would be lost to the rest of the world. I love this game. It's just basically a Defender clone, and if you don't know what Defender is, you can Google that and find out. But a Defender clone on the ZX Spectrum, a game that I loved in the arcades, that I could play in, well, my own bedroom for the first time. And not only that, this game just absolutely sucked me in, and I can still play that and feel those nostalgic feelings even today, which I have done quite recently, and I do on a regular basis. Orbiter, coming in at number 8. Coming in at number 7, we're going forward in the future again, and a little bit further this time, but not too much further, because it's going to be 1989 and 1990. Well, 1990 is when I experienced the game myself, and it's still on the ZX Spectrum, and that game is Batman. Now, of course, this was the game that was based off the movie. It had some wonderful levels in it where you would not only do your regular platforming type things, you would also have the Batwing, which you could go out and try and take down the gas-filled balloons that the Joker had put out. And of course, there was even a chemistry lab in it at one point, in which the idea was to try and work out how to neutralise the Joker's poisonous gas. Now, why this game is memorable to me is not so much the game. The game is fine, but this marked the end of the 8-bit microcomputers for me, because once I got to this stage, I just didn't see the advantage over the arcades anymore. I wasn't quite so young. I was coming up on 16, 17 years of age, and yes, the arcades had far better technology in them back then in the very late 80s and early 90s, and the old ZX Spectrum couldn't compete at that point. So it was at this point, this was the very last game that I ever had for the system. And just to show you, because you've seen the two cartridges before, or you might think they were cartridges, these are cassette tapes, because yes, back in the day we used to load a lot of our games in via a cassette tape, and I just wanted to show you that because, well, it's a wonderful piece of history. And as much as I do like loading a tape in, it takes a very long time, and I'm kinda glad that modern technology has taken away the need for this, as much as I have a lot of nostalgia for it. But yes, Batman coming in at number 7, purely because it was the end of my 8-bit microcomputer, well, fascination at the time, as I was ready to move on to bigger and better things. Now, I thought at the time it was only going to be the arcades, but something else was coming up, and of course you'll see that a bit later on. Coming in at number 6, we're moving on in time again to 1991, and the game, the memorable game from 1991 for me, and probably for a lot of people, is none other than Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, why is this game so memorable to me? Well, it's quite simple. As I said in the previous number, I was moving away from the 8-bit microcomputers. I had actually sold my last ZX Spectrum, a Plus 3, which I do regret, and to this day regret selling that. But I did, because I was moving on, and that's what we did back in the day. But this came along. Now, it wasn't my game to start with. For Christmas 1991, my younger brother was going to get a Mega Drive. Now, I had no real knowledge or interest in the Mega Drive at the time. But my father, being my father, said to me, as I was getting on now, I was going to be 18 years of age, to come along down to my grandmother's house, where he was going to test out the Mega Drive before he gave it to my brother on Christmas Day. And of course, I decided to pop along with him and see what all the hype was about. And let me tell you, when he put the Mega Drive on and he put on Sonic the Hedgehog, that was completely world changing for me. For the first time ever, I could honestly sit down at that moment in time and say, at last, the arcade experience has made it into the home. And it was all down to this little blue blur of a fellow here, Sonic the Hedgehog. It's a game that I still love, and I can still play and still do play today. But it was memorable because, again, it shifted the gaming landscape for me back in 1991. So Sonic the Hedgehog at number 6. So coming in at number 5, I have a memorable game here, but it's a memorable game from an era. And that era for me was 1993 to 1996. And I've got a game here because it's a very memorable game, and it's a game that I can show you here today from that era, and it's Zeus, Master of Olympus. Now, for anyone that doesn't know what this game is, it's one of the Age of Empire games where you commanded an army, real-time strategy game, but this one was set in ancient Greece, or not even ancient Greece, mythological Greece, where you could take your armies and build your cities and go up against things like the Hydra, or Ares, for example, the god of war and his dragon, and all sorts of wonderful mythological creatures. Now, I've picked this game because, one, I can show it to you. It's one of the few that I still have here in the collection. But I'm talking about an era of gaming where, well, I was no longer a child. I was in my early 20s, and, well, it totally changes the way you game. One, you're either in college or university, or you're working, so you have less time to game than you did before. But what was most memorable for me from this era was, it was the first time where I would not only stay up late to game to get an extra hour or two of gaming in, which I could do, making my own decisions as an adult at the time, and also get myself up maybe an hour or two earlier than I needed to for college, university and work later on, obviously, to play some more games. So Zeus, Master of Olympus, yes, it's a wonderful game and so many memories of it, but so many memories of this particular era, the early to mid 90s in PC gaming. Coming in at number 4 in my top 10 memorable games, it's another landmark game. It's another game also that will be on many other top 10s for various different reasons. But for me, this game was hugely important, and that game is Resident Evil on the PlayStation. Now, yes, you can take a proper look at this one. This one is pretty beat up, but I have had this boy, well, since the very first day, and he's staying with me, obviously. But why is it memorable? It's memorable because I was PC gaming, like you saw in the previous number, and the PlayStation, well, that changed everything for me. Again, it wasn't through my own research or desire to go out and seek these things out. It was a friend who said, come and see this PlayStation, it's fantastic, you will love it. I went, I sat down, I watched him play this, and it had me from the beginning. From that very first cheesy line telling Jill not to open that door, from the zombie reveal as Jill, if you played as Jill of course, when she goes into that corridor for the first time, and the moment that the dogs jump out the window, well, I was hooked. And the very next day I was out getting my own PlayStation and this copy of Resident Evil, which, what a wonderful game. And again, not only that, this was probably the first game that I would ever consider that I managed to speedrun. I could do this game in under an hour and a half, just purely because I was so infatuated with it at the time that I would play it straight after playing it, and again I could sit and play it all day when it first came out, and for a good while after as well. So coming in at number 4, Resident Evil. Coming in at number 3, we're not moving too much forward in time, we're probably not moving much more in time anyway from now to the end of this list. But the game that's coming up for number 3, which was released after Resident Evil, or at least I played it after Resident Evil, is another game on the PlayStation, and it's Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars. Now, if you don't know what this game is, it's a point and click adventure, and if you don't know what a point and click adventure is, go to Dad and Lads Gaming and start sending messages to Tommy. Tommy will answer all your questions on point and click adventures better than I could any day of the week. But a point and click adventure, yes, it's a wonderful point and click adventure. It's probably, I could probably say this is my favourite point and click adventure. Now, there are a lot of great ones out there that I also love, such as Monkey Island and the Sierra games like Police Quest and King's Quest, and I could go on and on. But Broken Sword for me is, well, it's possibly my favourite because of such cherished memories playing it. Now, the memories that I have playing it, however, wasn't just sitting playing it myself. This was a game that I sat and played with a group of friends, and we would kind of try and work out the puzzles together. It was a very, very social time in my gaming history, and this game just managed to slide into that perfectly. Now yes, only one player and only one controller, but it was the interaction between your friends sitting, trying to work out the puzzles, trying to work out what to do next, and it was such a wonderful experience. And so much so that we played it more than once, and it became a game that not only was a game to us, it was more like a movie night as well. This is one of the most quoted games that I can remember from certainly that time back in the mid to late 90s, but also it's probably my most quoted game of all time between myself and, well, some of my oldest friends, and that's Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars. Coming in at number 2, we're staying with the PlayStation and we're moving to 1997. And before I start getting boos and hisses and people hitting me up in the comments, well, people who know me and have subscribed to the channel hitting me up in the comments, because this is what's going to be the number 2 game, because, well, it's Final Fantasy VII. And yes, you all know this is this is my favourite game of all time. I think this is the greatest game of all time. I love it with a passion, but it's not the reason I picked it for a memorable game. Yes, it's a memorable game because 1, it introduced JRPG to the West without a shadow of a doubt, and 2, it's such a great game, probably the greatest ever, and I can't tire of saying that. But the reason it's a memorable game for me was not so much all of that stuff, but one particular sort of incident that happened during playing this game. Now, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother back in the late 90s when this game was obviously in my midst, and you have to bear in mind my grandmother was in her 70s at the time, so she was not a gamer. She had no interest in video games. She had obviously never grew up with video games and was never going to get into video games. I have played many video games in front of my grandmother over the course of the 3 decades or so leading up to this point, but for some reason when she saw me playing this, now it wasn't for the wonderful intricate storyline, it wasn't for the new polygonal 3D graphics, it wasn't for the battle system, no. What my grandmother loved about this, and what she would always ask me if I sat down to play the PlayStation while she was present, was, "Are you going to race those big chickens again tonight? Because I do like watching you race those big chickens." Now, for anybody who doesn't know what was being said there, she was an absolute fan of the Chocobo races. And don't ask me why, she just absolutely loved it. And you know, that was fine by me, because when you're grinding those chocobos to get yourself a gold chocobo, to get yourself knights of the round, then if you've got an avid supporter watching you that just happens to be your 70 plus year old grandmother, well, how can you not remember that moment and that time in your life? So there we go, Final Fantasy VII, but more importantly, chocobo racing with your grandmother. So here we are, finally at number 1 now. As I said, I've done this chronologically. These memories, I haven't rated them from 10 to 1 in my favourite memories, because you know what, that's probably harder to do than rating video games 10 to 1. Unless of course you get Final Fantasy VII or Suikoden 2 in there, then they're straight up winners. But moving on to this game, and we're moving forward in time again, and we're moving to the noughties, the 2000s, and onto a new system, the PlayStation 2. Now this game that I'm about to show you, it's memorable for 2 reasons. 1, I really didn't want it. I had no interest in it at all. I had just had a messy separation with my last PlayStation 2, was moving on to get the new PlayStation 2, and this was the game that was supposed to come with it as a bundle, and I really did. I fought tooth and nail. I had no interest. I even offered the shop assistant just to keep it for themselves because I had no interest, but alas, I had to buy the PlayStation 2 because I needed the PlayStation 2 replacement, and I had to get this game along with it. Now that's not why it's memorable, however, it's one of the reasons, and that game is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. And the reason that it is memorable is because after not wanting this game, and then sitting down and playing with my friends at the time, the same friends that played Broken Sword with me and so many other games, and absolutely loving this game. Now it's not a 2-player game by any stretch of the imagination, but you know what, it's a great couch co-op game, and by that I quite simply mean that you take a run at it, you get a set time to do so many or as many of the tasks in one of the levels as you can, and you take that shot, and then after that time's out you pass the pad and someone else takes over and tries to mop up the remaining tasks that you have to do in that level to progress the levels. And just fantastic good fun. I had no idea how much fun this was going to be, obviously having fought tooth and nail against getting it in the first place, but then to sit down and not only enjoy it that first day with the group of friends that I had, and they all adored it as well, but to go on and probably play this exclusively for about 3 months after getting it. And that is why this is one of my top 10 memorable games of all time. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, and what a soundtrack. So there you go, my friends, that's my top 10 memorable games from, well, across so many decades there, as you probably realise when I brought out that Pong machine at the beginning. Now, of course, this was a shout out, this was a tag from Scott at SEGABlocks, and I now have to tag some other people in this. And just who do I want to tag in this video and find out what their top 10 memorable games are? Well, firstly, I'm going to go with another 8-bit micro boy, and this one, well, you know what, I've got a bit of beef with him because he's more C64 than he is Specky, and I don't often like to, utter the word C64, but that person just happens to be RetroBear. So RetroBear, you better be watching this, and you better get together your top 10 memorable games. Now, for the second of my 3 tags, I'm going to stick with the retro at the beginning, but tag on a bear at the end. That's correct, I'm going for the king of the community, RetroBear, because quite frankly he's almost got a gaming history as long as mine, just a smidgen less, and I'm sure he's got some fantastic gaming memories to share with us. So RetroBear, I want to see your top 10 memorable games. So for the last tag of this video, I've decided to go across the pond, and you know what, I'm going to cheat just a bit. If I'm going all the way across the pond, I'm going to fit in as much as I can, and I'm going to tag 6 people, but 3 couples. That's right, I'm going to tag Retro Rivals, Scott and Jen. I want to see 5 and 5. I'm not going to make you do the 10 memorable games each, but 5 and 5. And the next couple in the same vein with 5 and 5, well, a Co-ople of Nerds. So Fresh and Mary, get working on those memorable games because I want 5 off you each. And the last couple, well, none other than Do You Nerd. So Tom, Lacey, 5 games each, your top 5 memorable games each, and I'd like to see them as soon as possible. Now, if you want to talk about any of the games that you've seen me share today, then well, drop that down in the comments, because I love nothing more than the interaction between you and me, because that's what makes YouTube worthwhile. Of course, if you've liked the video, leave me a thumbs up on the way out, and if you haven't already subscribed, well, feel free to subscribe for more. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, especially if you made it all the way to here, and until next time, as always, cheerio!